My name's Kohinoor. I'd like to ask Anushka, regarding the remarkable progress that's been made in several regions of Sri Lanka, what's being done to replicate that progress in the northern region? And secondly, particularly, so targeting the poorer regions, but also targeting the most vulnerable population groups, particularly the war widows. I just want to know if there's any policies at the moment. Thanks.
Okay. Any more questions? Yep.
Thank you. Tom Sanderson from BBC Media Action. Can you say anything about the distribution of employment across small, medium or large enterprises, and whether the growth has been focused at the small end, the medium or the large?
Okay, that's a specific question for both, across both countries, I guess. We have a third question maybe, and then we can get some answers.
Hello, Steve Brady, RTI International. On the presentation, it listed under the challenges the mismatch between skills and labour market requirements. I think certainly in some of the workforce programs we've looked at, this lack of skills, foundational, technical and soft, and the mismatch between what's being taught in technical and educational institutions is actually quite critical. I wondered if there was any examples where there is, or need for further research, where skills development, employment creation policy programs have been coordinated and implemented together to achieve or amplify results.
Okay, so sort of linking different skills programs together in the same place. Okay. Maybe we can go first to you then, Anushka, since there was a specific question to you about replicating progress in the north, and perhaps some specific programs targeting vulnerable population or vulnerable sections of the population.
Thanks. I think that was a really important question because the focus right now, both or has been post-war with the government and also development institutions, has been how do we kickstart these economies, conflict-affected economies of the north and east. So I think the first thing that I will say is the big thing that has been done to ensure that employment growth, we see the kind of performance in the north and east that we've seen in the West, I think has been about restoring connectivity. Because for so many years, those economies were cut off from the mainstream economy of the rest of the country, cut off from the only international airport and international port that we had, which was in Colombo. So I think a big part of this recovery of economic opportunity in the north and eastern regions has been reconstructing the railways with donor assistance and with a huge debt-fuel public infrastructure drive, reconstructing the highways and linking some of these farmers and other producer groups to markets in the rest of the country. So I think that has been the focus for the large part when we look at the north and east. But the issue there is that these economies and the people have been cut off for so long that, and it's been they've often depended on a very small market within that region, and now adjusting to almost competition from outside, and not outside the country but outside their region, has meant a lot of adjustment costs for them. That's one side. Of the other side is that for so long there's been a lot of dependence on handouts and various forms of funding by development agencies in livelihood programs and so on. And now they have the capacity to produce, but again, facing the competition, but also actually selling what they produce or actually being part of the labor market is something that we're seeing hasn't quite worked out yet. And I think that'll require active labor market programs, more skills training, job creation programs, entrepreneurship training, even the simple act of how do I find a market in the rest of the country and overseas. On your question, particularly on the most vulnerable groups, you're absolutely right. It's really these war-affected communities. And it's not just the war widows. We have hundreds of female-headed households in these areas, but it's also men who've been affected by the war, a lot of disabilities, ex-combatants. So there's a huge program going on now done by various people, and it's not just government, various development partners and so on, to get them to up their skills essentially and get retrained. But again, it comes back to the issue of how do they connect to these new market opportunities, and that is something that we haven't yet seen. And there are a lot of programs to help war widows. I know, for instance, the cover image in this publication is handlooms, a woman at a handloom factory. There's a lot of potential for that kind of industry among the war widows in the north and east, and that training is happening, and they are getting back to that kind of occupation. But telling what they produce to the rest of Sri Lanka and abroad, that is the gap that we're not seeing getting addressed very quickly. But it's just been a few years since the end of the war. So
that's an interesting point also about the growing interconnections and infrastructure investment are actually creating more competition. So integrating parts of the country back into the national market are in themselves having sort of competitive effects. So we had other questions about the employment distribution across SMEs and larger firms even. The skills and labour mismatch. Who wants to?
I think I'll go for the first,
Okay.
and then maybe you want to take the second one. Well, basically what we can see in terms of Uganda is employment is growing fastest within micro firms, so employing less than 5, following that small firms, then medium, and then large scale, so it's quite clear and linear. However, there's not been too many efforts of supporting these micro firms and their growth. We can also see that newer firms tend to employ more people than older firms, so the firms have been started within the 10, even 5 years. There's been some indications of what could be done to further support smaller and micro firms. One of them being the flat tax rate of 30%. That could be challenging for micro firms and small firms. Another suggestion is that further promote public agriculture investments, as these has been very, very small over the period, and also in the latest budget they did increase, but they're still at a very, very low rate. So further support agricultural public investments to spur and grow further the agriculture and livelihood transformation. What we can see, perhaps, this move towards tradable goods could benefit, and what also was Moses said about value chain integration. Since they're tradable, they don't depend on the size and sustainability of the local market, but rather they can trade abroad, and thus linking Ugandan farmers and other producing tradable goods, not only agriculture but also others, with regional market and regional hubs, and therefore perhaps further this regional integration. In terms of Sri Lanka, basically we have what's been the focus of BOI has mainly been foreign investments, often quite large scale. There's been a SME development bank and an SME development program. However, the outcomes of this project are a bit more unclear. Maybe Anushka knows more about this, but we're not really clear on what's been the outcomes of those.
Okay. And Laura, on the skills bit, perhaps?
Yeah. I think I mentioned that it's quite hard to quantify the impact of all the skills programs because there are so many, and there are different actors, and some are good, some are bad. There are different qualities, there are different things that they try to do. However, there are some attempts to try to perhaps integrate better the technical education sector. In Sri Lanka, perhaps it's a bit more clear. There is a national vocation qualification system that was created during the period of analysis. I think it was 2006, if I'm correct. And it was an attempt to create a system of vocational qualifications that different institutions could tap on and say, we provide this qualification that is listed in this system. Moreover, it was also an attempt to try to link the technical education sector with the higher education sector, because there were some problems with linking, like people going out from secondary education would go to the technical sector or the universities. Whilst this new system, what it tries to do is that you could go to the technical sector and you could stay there, or you could then further progress into the higher education sector. The final thing that was interesting about this case was the links with the private sector. And I think this is quite important if you want to have a more unified skill system, is that there needs to be some assessment and of what are actually the skills that are needed, because the different programs, as I said, they tap different types of skills that they try to deliver, but ultimately there needs to be like a thinking about what is needed for the country as a whole and for the private sector. What are the skills that they identify as lacking in the country? I wanted to say something, if I may, about the I guess it's somehow related to the war regions in Sri Lanka, and is that actually the Sri Lankan labor force doesn't cover the eastern and northern regions of Sri Lanka until quite recent.
Labor force survey.
The labor force survey, sorry, yes. So it's quite hard to know what's happened there, and now they're covered. So from now on, we could make assessments, but there's also some data limitations of assessing progress, and they're quite important. And so perhaps the progress that we describe in this report is not covering those regions because we didn't have the data to analyze it. We know there are programs, like Anushka mentioned this program, but we cannot see with the data we have what's the progress over the last 20 years. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I was maybe going to just direct also the question about the SMEs maybe to Moses. I mean, I forgot to mention that Moses is from the Private Sector Foundation. He's Director of Policy Research at the Ugandan Private Sector Foundation. So it might even be interesting from your perspective, Moses. Well, what is the sort of the share of SMEs actually that are part of your foundation? And just in terms, is Moses gone? Okay, Moses is gone. Okay, so well, I had a good question for him, but he missed out on that one. Okay, so maybe we're going to have just one more little round of questions, and then I'm going to pass to Professor van der Hoeven. Yes, please, at the back.
Thank you. My name is Antoinette Salah. I'm an agricultural consultant. And my question is to Anushka and the panelists. A lot has been said about agricultural productivity or lack of productivity in both countries, in Uganda and Sri Lanka. I believe that agriculture development can be one of the greatest absorber of youth and women's unemployment. I wanted to know from the panelists and Anushka, what are the government and the policy makers' attempts to make agriculture development more attractive to the youth and women?
Okay, so that's quite a concrete question there. There's another question at the back on the right.
Good morning. Good morning, Leah Mubayat from Plan UK. I have a question also for Anushka regarding aspirations, what you mentioned about youth aspirations and the mismatch between, what they've been sort of like trained to do and what they really aspire to do. Do you think it's a problem linked to career guidance and vocational guidance, or do we need to see other factors behind it? Thank you.
What was the first? Related to what kind of guidance?
Vocational guidance
okay.
And career advising. Thank you.
Career advising. Okay, sorry, that was the one I didn't get. Okay, is there one? Okay, we've got, maybe let's have two more questions here and then we'll see, and we're going to wrap up quickly.
Thanks. I'm Georgina from Comic Relief. I just wondered whether or not for the panel, for everyone really, whether or not there was a trade-off between job creation and creating decent jobs, and whether the focus isn't just creating jobs, or whether or not there's a sort of an underlying imperative as well around decent jobs.
Yep, a good question about the trade-off. So that last question here, and then we'll need to round up rather quickly. But yes, please.
Hi, Catherine Blambeed from the One campaign. My question kind of picks up on one of the points that Anushka made around the rising trends of automation and robotics. You mentioned in regards to the garment industry, but also obviously more broadly across industry. So I'd like to kind of put the question to anyone on the panel who wants to take it, of what do you think some of the implications of that are, not just in countries like Sri Lanka, but also across sub-Saharan African countries that might have been looking to emulate the kind of light manufacturing model in the next 10 to 20 years. But if that's not going to be kind of major soaker-upper of labour in the future, then what will be instead?
Okay, thank you very much. That question actually is probably going to be well addressed in the next session, which is looking at jobs for the future and precisely some of these shifts. So maybe if I can defer that one to later. What's being done to make agriculture more attractive? more clarification on the aspirations and the quantity versus quality. Maybe Anushka, can you maybe in 1 or 2 minutes see what you can address out of that?
Sure, thanks. Both really great questions. So on your question on what are some of the policies to make agriculture more attractive for youth, to be completely honest, government policies to directly do that just haven't been any. But there has been one thing that has worked, and that has been a little more indirect, and that has been government policy towards encouraging private sector to engage in new forms of commercial agriculture. And that has meant that a few companies that used to be fairly traditional companies that did a little bit of agriculture are now doing very, very clever forms of agriculture, new outgrower models, growing things that Sri Lanka never grew before. For instance, I mean, next time any one of you, God forbid, has a burger from Burger King, the pickle that you get in there is a huge quantity of pickles actually grown in Sri Lanka, those gherkin pickles. We never grew gherkins before. Sri Lankans don't even eat gherkin pickles. But the fact is that they were encouraged, new farmers were encouraged to grow new forms of things. And now in the north, for instance, fishermen who used to go out and catch regular fish are now being encouraged to, as a part-time occupation, to grow seaweed for export markets. So all of these young people are excited about this. Young people are excited about a plot of farming where they don't have to manually water the farm plot for an hour. Rather, they just switch on the very basic, not so expensive drip irrigation or sprinkler irrigation, and they just leave. It's not essentially in Sri Lanka. There's a huge trend towards jobs that don't get your hands dirty, and that a lot of young people say that. So really, on your question, policies, not direct policies, but indirect policies to get private sector involved has worked to get young people excited about agriculture again. Very quickly on this question of aspirations, you're right. I mean, it's a lot about this mismatch is also about managing expectations, guidance on the kind of skills young people need to have to be attractive to the new jobs that are emerging. And really, even this rise of the TVET kind of education, there needs to be a closer link to industry. And industry keeps saying we are not getting the kind of skills that we need. And maybe we need to look at new models where there's a much closer integration between industry groups, between trade chambers, between the private sector as a whole, and these vocational training programs, so that the delivery, the pedagogy, the curriculum, all of that is much more linked to the needs or the emerging needs of these industries. And I think that will go a long way in bridging this aspirational gap and the queuing.
Okay, very good. And maybe here a final word, maybe on the quantity versus quality, particularly, since we haven't.
Well,
is there a trade-off between the employment creation and decent jobs?
Perhaps what can be seen in the garment industry, this does not necessarily comes as any news, but these large investments into the garment industry, there's also been a criticism not only in Sri Lanka but also in other neighbouring countries about the labour regulations, about the work conditions up there. And this we included as one of our challenges, and I think this is an ongoing process where you want to attract investment but at the same time ensure that you have decent work regulations. Do you want to add anything to that?
I want to say that we tried to, when we were selecting these countries and analyzing these countries, we were trying to look at just the quantity of job created, the quality of it, and also the access, like who's accessing these jobs. And I don't think there's a country that has fared excellent in all of these three components. And we struggle a bit with defining employment progress. In theory, it sounds very good. We need to have these three components joined together to have a sustainable employment progress. But as Anna said, is perhaps a process, and we see, especially I guess in the Uganda case, that the country is starting in the right direction, but it's only starting, so it needs to keep going so that the three components join together, and we keep having employment progress in the future.
Okay, and perhaps maybe just do you want to sum up maybe we're going to come back, so maybe just 2 or 3 key points that emerge from you.
I think it's very difficult. We're speaking already in the time of the other speakers, so that's always difficult for those other speakers. So I just want to make 2 or 3 points, and then exactly. I think, but in general, we come back later. I think one of the points which came very much out of both the studies, I found them very good studies because they showed countries which are really in a path of development, structural change in different ways, is the whole balance between the sectors, manufacturing sector, service sector. And I think it will be important, I'll come back to that later also after the coffee break, to be much more breaking down in sectors. Service sectors for each country is a different kettle of fish. In very poor countries, the service sector is mainly informal, only a little bit of high-tech and in middle-income countries different. And it's important when you talk about those structural changes really to distinguish. It's done in the studies, I've read it, but I think it's also important to bring that more to the fore. And then another point, especially also in the service sector, and what's his name, Moses mentioned that already, is the difference between formal and informal sector. And then I want to go much further by breaking down also the informal sector in many different types of sectors. In different research institutes in the world now, quite some research is done on the informal sector, and if you can, for example, studies on West Africa show that if you take the informal small-scale sector, that is about 10 to 15% of those having an enterprise in those sector are really can make it. Then there's about 20%, which we call the constrained gazelles, who are people who can make it when they get the right support and the programs you mentioned. But there's probably a majority of the entrepreneurs in that sector will never become an entrepreneur, because they didn't choose to become an entrepreneur. They were an entrepreneur because of the either economic downfall or pressures. So one needs to look at that sector much more differently, and also look what is then the role of the government and the state in towards that sector. And so I'll stop there because I have lots of ideas of that, but that's for after the thing. Then also on the quality of employment, there's always this question on the quality of employment, and has also to do with the nature and type of jobs, and relates also to the question of trade-off between decent jobs and not decent jobs. If you remember, decent jobs have been identified by the ILO according to 4 criteria. One is labor rights, secondly is creation of employment, thirdly is social security, and fourthly is voice and representation, so the whole dynamic aspect. And you have to take those together. What you see actually is that if you have a system in which there's more representation and labor rights, then you get automatically a better distribution from the surplus which is created in those activities, and you can get at a kind of win-win situation, which we call that you can move towards a system where you have both decent jobs and also of sufficient employment creation. But if you don't have that countervailing power in the labor force, then often you see, and we noticed that also in these countries, but in other countries, that the inequality between capital and labor is increasing because of the growing globalization. So you need in that system also a better representation of those involved. Not only the formal trade unions. Formal trade unions sometimes try to protect themselves and don't want to have actually much to do with the informal sector, but in my opinion you need to combine that better so that you get a better process of redistributing the fruits of technology, because that is what technology is about. You become more productive, but only a part of the labor force is profiting from that high productivity, and other part is not profiting from that high productivity. And for that I think you need to look at different parts of participation. Now, the catch is that what we see at the moment with the manufacturing process and the deindustrialization which we see in the more middle-income countries, and the difficulty, in both cases showed it, to get onto the industrialization process, that actually those countries don't have yet the right type of representation and countervailing power. And that comes back to the politics you mentioned. If you go back when you see at the Industrial Revolution, you saw a countervailing power in the industrialization process, which then took some of the surplus away which were created by the industrialization process and distributed it over the workers and create a welfare state. So, but that's probably the challenge you're going to talk also about after coffee break.
That's very
Thanks,
useful. Thank you very much for that. So the granularity, the need to look below sectors, and also I think this point about voice is also an important one. So we started slightly behind schedule. We finished slightly behind schedule, only 10 minutes by my watch. So now we have a coffee break. We can maybe make that 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for the second session. Thank you very much.